Well, good morning. Once again, my name's Pastor Jonathan. I'm so grateful for each of you that are here today. Everybody is welcome at Harvey, and I'm glad that you are here today. Now, you may or may not know this about me, but I am a huge Apple guy through and through. I'm preaching from an iPad. I carry an iPhone in my pocket, and when I get green text messages, I always urge them to get an iPhone so they're blue. Anybody else with me? All right, nobody else wanted to raise their hand, but yeah. And in 2007, Apple came out with that new device called the iPhone. And I had a BlackBerry with Sprint, and back then it was only on AT&T, so I dropped my BlackBerry with Sprint, and I went and got me an iPhone with AT&T. And for years, the iPhone just had one camera lens on it. And you did what you do with cameras. You pointed at something, and you take a picture. If you need to get more in the picture, you'd step forward. If you needed to get, less in the picture, you'd step forward. If you need to get more in the picture, you'd step back, right? And watch where you're stepping back. A few years later, they added a zoom option so you could zoom in, which was amazing. Like you can go to the zoo and you want to see animals, you see deer in the field, you want to zoom in on that. But in 2019, Apple added something that changed everything. The 0.5 zoom, the wide angle. And as somebody that had a growing family, I was pretty happy that they added that because I could zoom out and get my whole family in the picture. Because no longer did you have to back up to get everybody in the picture. You just literally zoomed out. And the first time I used it, I remember thinking, I had no idea there could be this much in a picture. Like I'd take a photo of one of my kids close up, just their face, and I would think I had the whole story. But then when I zoomed out, I would see the faces and the expressions of people around them and everything that was going on in the backdrop, everything that was going else on in the scene. And many times now before I take a picture, I zoom out because I want to make sure that I'm not missing something. Because what I've learned is what fills the frame when you're zoomed in is almost never the whole picture. Hey, today, I want us to do something very similar with the final verses of the book of Ruth. We spent several weeks zoomed in on Naomi's suffering and zoomed in on Ruth's loyalty and zoomed in on Boaz's integrity. And it's all been real and it's been worth seeing. But in these last 7 verses of the book of Ruth, the narrator is going to zoom the camera out. And he's going to show us that there's far more going on in this picture than we've ever imagined or thought. In fact, our big idea for today is this: God is always working wider than our pain and better than our plans. Our big idea is God is always working wider than our pain and better than our plans. We've been in the book of Ruth for 6 weeks now, and I want to just do a brief recap in case this is your first time or if you missed a couple of weeks. The first week we saw a story of Naomi. And she was a widow, or she left Bethlehem, and she wasn't a widow yet. She had 2 sons, and she had a husband, and they left during a famine for an enemy country called Moab. And then we come to find out that Naomi's husband and both her 2 sons died while they were in this enemy country. And she came back to her hometown, Bethlehem, with one of her daughter-in-laws, Ruth, and she declared, "I'm no longer full, I'm empty." Not only that, her name Naomi means lovely. She says, "Don't call me lovely because I am bitter." So she instructed people to call her bitter. In chapter 2, we saw that Ruth, who had come back with Naomi, she went out to the fields to glean from the edges, to gather from the edges so that they would have something to eat, because these are 2 poor widows in an enemy country and they're hungry. They need something to eat. And she just so happens to end up in a field with a man named Boaz, who the text tells us is a worthy man, and we later come to find out who is one of their kinsman redeemers. He's kin to their family, and so he can redeem everything that they have lost. And then we see that Ruth went, in chapter 3, Ruth went to Boaz in the darkness of the night in a risky way, and Boaz promised that he would redeem her. And then last week we saw in chapter 4, Boaz went to the other redeemer. He earned the right to marry Ruth, and then they had a child together. That's where our story picks up today. So if you have your Bibles, I hope you do, take them out and turn to the book of Ruth. We were in Mark for way too long. The book of Ruth, and we're going to be in chapter 4, verses 16 through 22 today. I'm going to begin just by reading verse 16 and half of verse 17. It says this, beginning in verse 16 and reading half of 17. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi," and they named him Obed. So after Boaz and Ruth have this baby, the women of the village announce their blessing. We saw that last week. And then Naomi takes the child. She places this child on her lap, and she became his nurse. She became his nanny. We see the Naomi of chapter 1. She's surrounded by famine and barrenness and death. And we see the Naomi of chapter 4, and she's surrounded by a healthy harvest, a redeemer, and new life. And we read verse 16, and it says that she became his nurse, and it's sort of confusing when we read that language, but we need to understand the word for nurse here literally means caregiver, so we can understand that this grandma became the nanny. Many of your grandmothers have been that way, or many of you grandmas have been that way. You become the baby's nanny. That's a picture of a grandma gratefully accepting a blessing from God and a blessing of a grandbaby. The picture of Naomi's journey here is one from empty arms to one with filled arms. One who's in a place that she never thought she would be after she lost her husband. She lost her 2 sons, and they hadn't yet had kids with both their wives. And the narrator is showing us something incredibly beautiful here. It's a picture of God's provision for an aging widow, being given a grandbaby to hold, to take care of each and every day. And to really feel the weight of verse 16, we really have to look back all the way in chapter 1 in verse 21, where we see, "I went away full and the Lord brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? Why call me lovely when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity against me?" Naomi declared, "I'm empty." Her arms were empty. Her house was empty. Her future was empty. But then we see Naomi in chapter 4, verse 16. And those same arms that returned empty are now full. The same lap that made the long journey home in bitterness is now holding a child in it. The same woman who told Bethlehem, "Don't call me lovely," is now celebrated by these same women as they pray blessings over this child. God had not forgotten Naomi. God was at work even in her darkest season, bringing her from empty to full. Pastor I follow and respect, H.B. Charles, said this: "God may not replace, but God will restore." Naomi's husband, her sons, they were not replaced. But God restored Naomi in a way that she never saw coming. This child on her lap, as the women of Bethlehem had said just 3 verses earlier, was a restorer of life and a nourisher in her old age. Not a replacement, but a restoration. See, God's version of fullness is always better than what we could ever hope for or imagine. Now notice this, verse 17. The women of the neighborhood begin speaking up, and it may sound like at first that they're naming this baby, but I think we can understand this as the women saying, "A son has been born to Naomi," or of Ruth, and of Naomi, and the women of the neighborhood called his name Obed. Like they said his name out loud. They affirmed the name that was given to the child. This is an imagery of like a female chorus celebrating this baby's birth and declaring its significance. Anybody ever been around a group of ladies who are excited? Like they don't necessarily talk with words so much as with pitches, right? Like with tones. Like imagine this scene, like just excited ladies, like, and they're not talking so much in words, but in pitches, and they've seen Naomi in her bitterness, and now they see her in their fullness, and I can just imagine these ladies say, "Did you hear what his name was? Did you hear what his name was? Let me just tell you what his name was. It's Obed." You know what that means? You know what that means? It means the one who serves. That's Naomi's boy. That's what his name is. He's the one who serves. This is a reversal put on display. This is the imagery of what God has done. He's taken somebody from empty to full, from bitter to lovely. John Piper put it this way: "Our providences may be bitter, But God is at work for our good, whether we can see it or not. Naomi could not see it when she walked that road home. She could not see it when she told the women of Bethlehem to call her bitter. She could not see it when she laid down for the first night in an empty house. But God was at work. He was working even when she could not see it. He was working even in the bitter chapters of her life. Hey, today, maybe you're here and you're in a bitter chapter of your life. Maybe you're here today and you're in a season that feels like Naomi's season. Empty. Barren. I don't have anything that feels like home. You may have returned from something like a relationship or a career or a dream, and it's left you empty and it's left you grieving. But would you hear me this morning? The same God who filled Naomi's arms has not forgotten you either. He may not replace what you have lost, but He is the God who will restore you. And His restoration is always better than anything we could ever imagine or plan for ourselves. Even if it doesn't come in this life, hear me say that. It may not happen on this side of heaven. The best is yet to come. God was at work filling Naomi's arms, and God is at work filling your arms as well. Now, I want us to zoom out a little bit. I want us to tap that 0.5 on the phone and see what else may be in this scene that we haven't seen yet. I want us to pull the camera back because the narrator is about to show us that what we saw in Naomi's story wasn't the whole picture. When we zoom out, we can see that there's something much larger that's been going on in this whole story. So if you have your Bible, I want you to do something before we continue on in Ruth. If you flip back probably just 2 or 3 pages in your Bible, you're going to come to the last page of Judges. And Judges 21:25 says this. Look at it with me. It says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And then the very first chapter, the next verse in the Bible, Ruth chapter 1, verse 1 says this. It confirms, these are the days when the judges ruled. There were no king. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. These were dark days that this story is occurring in. Nations did whatever they wanted to do, however they wanted to do it, with no leader to rule or govern. These were days filled with corruption and violence and chaos and war. And into that time period, that's where we find the story of Ruth. 2 widows, a barley harvest, a man of integrity named Boaz, and a baby named Obed. And I want us to zoom out now and see a bigger picture of what God is doing in this moment. Let's pick up in verse 17 and read all the way to the end of the book of Ruth. It says this, and the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. Look at that. The narrator shows us something shocking. Obed was not the end of the story. He was a link in the story. He was the grandfather of David. Maybe you're here today and you're like, well, why is that significant? Look on the screen with me, 2 Samuel 5:3. It says this. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron. And King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord. And they anointed David king over Israel. Look at that. This baby that was on the lap of Naomi, this baby that took Naomi's arms from empty to full, was a link in the chain that puts a king on Israel's throne. And David is described as a man after God's own heart. That's who God was preparing in this moment. Can you see what God was doing in this story when we zoom out a little bit? See, when we zoom in, we see how God was working in the life of Naomi, one woman filling her arms. And that's a beautiful story worth celebrating. And we have for 5 weeks. But when we zoom out, we can see that God was also using Naomi's difficult days to simultaneously prepare to fill the arms of all of Israel. And Naomi was walking that road home from Moab in bitterness. Meanwhile, God was threading together a royal line for his people. While Naomi was lying awake in that empty house in Bethlehem, God was positioning the grandfather of a king that was a man after his own heart. While Naomi was calling herself bitter, God was writing David's name into her story. See, when we zoom out on this story, we see that God was using Naomi's dark days not only for his glory to fill her arms, but also to fill an entire nation's arms with a king after God's own heart. Sinclair Ferguson, I read this past week, and it just rocked me when I read it. He said this: the explanation for much that takes place in our lives lies beyond our lives, and it may be hidden to us all through our lives. For God does not mean to touch only our lives by what he does in us, but he has the lives of others in view, even the unborn. God has not yet finished his business. That's why our lives can seem so untidy as people of God. Think about that for a moment. In this moment, God's not only meaning to touch your life by what he does in your life, but he also has the lives of others in view through your life. Even those not yet born that we don't even know yet. Like Naomi had no idea that she was a part of God's plan for Israel. She just knew she felt empty. Ruth had no idea that she was part of God's plan for Israel. She was just doing the next right thing. Boaz had no idea that he was a part in God's plan for Israel. He was just simply a man walking in integrity and faithfulness. See, these everyday human beings were simply living their lives like you and I are living our lives today. And yet God was using their ordinary, everyday faithfulness and even their dark seasons to prepare a king for a nation who was in crisis. Hey, today, maybe you're like me and your life just feels untidy at times. I love that word Ferguson used. Maybe your life feels untidy. Maybe your suffering feels unexplainable. Maybe the seasons that you're in are dark, and the reason that we can't make sense of our circumstances is because God's not only writing our story, he's also writing other stories through our lives in this moment. That's why I always say, God doesn't give us our stories to keep them to ourselves. Your stories of your dark days, your stories of your suffering. You never know how you sharing that story may help somebody else who's going through the same dark season. Even our stories of darkness that are because of our sin. We're like, it's my fault I went through that. When we share that, we never know how God may use our stories to help others fight that same sin so their story doesn't have to be your story. How may God use your story on the other side of your suffering? Hey, God has far more plans for our stories than we could ever imagine. Alistair Begg put it this way. He said, history matters. Your history matters. You are who you are to some significant degree because of who your parents are, who your grandparents were, and so on. Inevitably, you and I are products of our lineages, and as a result, we are living proof of God's providence, which has brought us to this place in this moment. And we read that, and we know that today. But for many of us, our lineages include parts and areas that we'd rather not be part of our past. But yet they are. It's still part of our past. It's still part of what our fathers and our mothers and grandmothers and grandfathers and greats did. And here's what I tell people often: your past doesn't have to determine your future. Your children and grandchildren don't have to carry that same lineage. By God's grace, you can be the turning point in the lineage of your family stories. Today, you have the opportunity to shape someone else's lineage. So when they talk about my great-grandfather and my grandfather, you've shaped that history. Maybe today you suffer in some way because of your lineage, but for your children and your grandchildren and for your great-grandchildren, that doesn't have to be their story. H.B. Charles put it this way. He said, through Ruth and Boaz, God would raise up a man after his own heart to be king of Israel. This genealogy of verses 18 through 22 is not a boring list of names. It is evidence of the covenant faithfulness of God on display for over 900 years. 900 years of God keeping his word, one generation of time, at a time, from Perez all the way to David. See, every name in this genealogy is the living proof of God's faithfulness. Every generation, through famines and exiles and war and grief and ordinary human sinfulness and weakness, would still pass the line on to the next generation. It's a testimony of a God who keeps his covenant promises regardless of what his people do. Hey, for you and I today, the suffering that we can't explain, the season that makes no sense, maybe the chapter in your life that has not yet been resolved, God may be doing in and through your life far more than you can ever see or imagine. See, we see zoomed in, but God sees zoomed out. He sees how he's using our lives to affect the lives of other people, even the unborn. And in this story, when we zoom out, we see that God was already at work filling Israel's arms with the king that they needed in this very story. But I wonder, what if we zoom out a little bit more? What if we just zoom out just a little bit more? What might we see in this story? What may God be up to in this story? And you say, Pastor, what are you talking about? We just read everything in the book of Ruth. Well, the book of Ruth is done, but the work of God is not yet done. I want you to look at me at another genealogy we see in the Bible, in the very first pages of the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 1. And I'm going to start reading in verse 2, and you'll have to excuse my redneck as I try to read all these names. If you're a New Testament scholar in here, forgive me. Give this Mississippi redneck a break on all these names. But look at Matthew chapter 1, verses 2 through 16. It says this: Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez. We just saw that name. And Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and the Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab. We just saw those names. And Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king, and it keeps going. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah, and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation to Babylon, Echoniah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Elihud, and Elihud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of, hold up, Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Christ. Look at that. Ruth, Boaz, Obed, Jesse, David. Right here in the opening of the New Testament. And when we zoom the picture out all the way, what we see is what the book of Ruth has been pointing to the whole time. That while God was at work in the dark days of Naomi's life, filling her arms, God was also simultaneously at work in the dark days of Israel, filling the nation's arms. And when we zoom out all the way, what we see is God was also simultaneously at the work in humanity's dark days, preparing the lineage that He would send our Redeemer into the world to fill our empty arms as well. You see, while God was bringing Naomi from emptiness to fullness, He was also laying the groundwork to bring all of us from emptiness to fullness in His Son, through His Son, Jesus Christ. See, the book of Ruth is not primarily a love story. On the surface, it may be. When we get down deep, when we zoom out, we see that the book of Ruth is primarily a story about how God, in His sovereign providence, was preparing for the coming of Jesus Christ. God was at work through the ordinary faithfulness of an aging widow, through a foreign daughter-in-law, through a wealthy Israelite farmer in a barley field, preparing the way for our Redeemer, Jesus Christ. John Piper put it this way: if this story of Ruth just ended at that little Judean village with an old grandmother hugging a baby, a new grandson, glory would be too big of a word. But the author doesn't leave it there. He lifts his eyes to the fars and to the mountain snows of redemptive history, and all of a sudden we realize that all along something far greater has been occurring than we could have ever imagined. See what happens when we zoom out? Naomi went from empty to full. God was at work for her. Israel went from no king in dark days to having a king who was after God's own heart. And when we zoom all the way out, we see that God was also working through all of it to send us a Redeemer from the nations, through the nations, for the nations, to take all of us from empty to full. Because that is what we are without Jesus Christ in our lives. Amen. We're empty. Without Christ, we are Naomi without the blessing. We're Israel without the king. We're the widows on the road who are saying, don't call me lovely. Call me bitter. But the gospel declares that God has not forgotten you and I either. God has provided a Redeemer. Who knew this little love story about a bitter widow and a clinging daughter-in-law and a worthy man of integrity would lead to the greatest love story ever told? A Redeemer for us all, who turns our emptiness into fullness, who accepts us, who are the foreigners, as welcome family. It's a beautiful story. And that is the story of Ruth. I could probably just stop right there, but I want us to walk through and make a few observations and applications from the text this morning. The first application is this: is God is always at work, and you can trust Him. Naomi could not see it on the road from Moab. Ruth couldn't see it in the barley field. Boaz couldn't see it at the city gate. None of them knew they were part of a story that was bigger than them. They were simply trusting and obeying God. And God was using their ordinary, everyday faithfulness, doing the next right thing, to write the biggest story ever. Hey, today in this room, whatever season you are at in life, whether it makes sense or not, whether it's full or whether it's empty, the God who was at work in Bethlehem is still at work in your life today. 2 Thessalonians 3:3 says this, the Lord is faithful. He will establish you and guard you against the evil one. Romans 8:28, which has been an underlying theme, or maybe it's an underlying theme written about the book of Ruth. We see this. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purposes. Hey, believer in this room, God is faithful. Amen. God is at work. He is guarding you against the evil one. And if you love God and you are following his purposes, he is working all things out for your good and for his glory. So remember, when the enemy tries to beat you down and tell you otherwise, that God is at work, and we have a God that we can trust because he is faithful and he's told us so, and he always keeps his promises. Amen. Trust the sovereign control of God, even when you can't see his hand at work. Second application. God may be doing far more than you imagine with your story. I talked about this a second ago, but I want to lean into it a little bit more. God doesn't mean to only touch your lives by what he's doing in your lives. He has the lives of others in view that he's using you to touch others. See, you're seeing this season, this difficulty is not the whole story. And you may never know on this side of heaven how God has been working through your life, through your dark seasons, through your difficult days. But one day when we are in the fullness of the glory of God forever and we're able to zoom out, we're going to be able to see how God has been painting a way bigger picture than we could have ever imagined or hoped for. Remember when I graduated from college, I'd been in a relationship for a significant amount of time and it ended. And I was just heartbroken like a 22-year-old is. But God was preparing me for someone in Texas, lovely bride, who was better than anyone or anything that I could have ever hoped for or imagined. When I look back in my life, I see scenes that didn't make sense in that moment. And I'm just now starting to get a glimpse of how God has had me in the right place at the right time to use me for his glory and to work out my life for my good by walking in obedience to him. And I still can't see the full picture. And I won't be able to on this side of heaven. Hey, in your life today, I don't know how God is using your scenes to write his story. But I do know this. I want to caution us from ever getting tunnel vision. We can put the blinders on and we just see the here and now. But today, would you focus that God may be doing far more than you could ever imagine or hope for with your story? Everything we do in obedience to God, no matter how small, is significant. John Piper said it's a part of a cosmic mosaic which God is painting to display the greatness of his power and the wisdom to the world. So Christian, no matter what season you may be in, let's be faithful. Let's be faithful in walking in obedience to do the next right thing. And we may never know how God is using our everyday, ordinary faithfulness, integrity, and hardships or difficulties to touch other lives. Stay faithful. God may be doing far more through your story than you could ever imagine or that we can see. Walk in obedience. Stay faithful. Last application. God has provided a Redeemer for us all. The best news we got through the book of Ruth wasn't even in the book of Ruth. It was in Matthew chapter 1, where we see all along God wasn't just preparing a Redeemer for Ruth and Naomi. He wasn't just preparing a Redeemer for the nation of Israel, but he was preparing a Redeemer for us all. And here's what the whole of the gospel tells us. That there is a God who is good and he's perfect, and he created each and every one of us, and he loves you. But then we also know from Genesis 3 and throughout the Bible that each of us in our lives have a sin nature. We've all done something wrong We've lied or stolen or cheated or lusted. Something that has broke our relationship with God, who is perfect and cannot be associated with sin. So the bad news that we find out in the Bible is that our sin has separated us from our Creator and from our God. But then we see this good news in the Bible, that God loved you so much that He literally sent Himself. He stepped out of heaven into earth. He became fully God. He became fully man. He's born of a virgin. And do I fully understand it? No. But do I fully believe it? Absolutely. He's fully God. He was fully man. He lived a fully perfect, sinless life. He did not deserve death. He did not deserve the wrath of God. That's what we deserve. But yet what He did is He went to the cross on our behalf as the payment for your sin. And He gave His life on that cross. He took the full wrath of God so that we don't have to. He died, and then 3 days later He rose from the grave. Today, what this book tells us, if we would turn from our sin, I don't mean we're perfect. It means I don't want to do those things anymore. If we would confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, that He is ruling our life, and we would follow Him, He can and He will save us. That He can be your Redeemer. That when God looks at you, He no longer sees your sinfulness, but He sees the righteousness of His own Son that has been placed upon you. Like, how amazing is that? We don't get what we deserve, the wrath of God, but we get the righteousness of God placed on us. We did nothing to deserve that. All along in this book of Ruth, God was preparing the way for a Redeemer that you can cry out to today. God, I want to turn from my sin. That means I'm perfect. I believe you are the Christ, and I want you to rule my life, and I want to follow you. Have you done that today? If not, today the invitation is simple. You are the one on the road saying, I'm bitter and I'm empty. And Jesus looks at you and He says, you're lovely. And He offers to fill you, to forgive you. The Redeemer says, come, I will redeem you. Now we begin in chapter 1, book of Ruth. A woman walking home in bitterness and empty arms. And then we get here, Naomi's arms are full. We zoom out and we see a nation that was supplied with a king. And we zoom out even further and we see that God had supplied a Redeemer available to every single human, that God was at work. But can I just say this? I've got incredibly good news for you. The best is yet to come. God is still at work. He's still the same God. He's still at work in your life. He's still threading together stories you don't even know that are connected on this side of heaven. And the best is yet to come. One day, if you are a believer of Jesus Christ, in the fullness of the glory of God in a real place called heaven, we're going to have all of eternity to be mesmerized how God has used all of our stories for His glory and for our good. Stay faithful, dear brother and sister. God is doing far more than you could ever imagine or hope for, and the best is yet to come. Our big idea for today is this. God is always working wider than our pain and better than your plans.